So Hebrews 3 and 4 has a pretty tight relationship with Psalm 95. We took a look at this in your lessons tonight. And it's this tight relationship that begins here in Hebrews 3, 7 through 11, right? I've highlighted it here in the second half of verse 7. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as when they provoked me, as in the day of trial in the wilderness. And it's a quote of, and I'm just going to take you there real quick, it's a quote of Psalm 95, verses 7 through 11, the last part of 7, right? We took a look at this. It's not only a quote here, though, it's not just in 3, 7 through 11, but we also see it in 3:15. There's a little bit of a quote there. There's some in 4:3. There's some in 4:5. There's another mention in 4:7. There's this tight relationship between Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, this discussion of rest, and this psalm for some reason. So we're going to spend a little bit of time, not just this week, but next week as well, kind of digesting what this psalm is saying and why is it that the author of Hebrews wants to take us back there. But you notice that there were some differences between the psalm and the Hebrews quote of that psalm. And there were several that I'm not going to mention tonight, but the ones I'm going to mention are the place names. When we're here in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 8, what we read is that do not harden your hearts as when they provoked me. We hear about a provocation or a rebellion against God, right? Depending on your English translation. As in the day of trial in the wilderness. There was a day of trial in the wilderness when God was provoked. Well, if you keep reading this, it was pretty much the 40 years. It was the whole time, and it could be understood because that's what the people did during the whole time. But the problem with that is, when we go back to Psalm 95, verse 8, that Hebrews passage is quoting, it has two place names. It has Meribah, as in the day of Massa. We've lost the provocation, and we've lost the day of trial from the Hebrews passage, and they've turned into place names, Meribah and Massa, which we sent you back into the Old Testament, have specific places and events that happened at that one place. So Psalm 95 would suggest that we're not talking about the 40 years as a whole, but Psalm 95 would suggest that there's something that happened at that place, at that event, that is something that we need to pay attention to, because the author of Hebrews says, don't respond the way they did there. And so the question is, where? Right? So, what's going on? Why this difference? That was one of your questions. I'm not sure if you came up with it or not. But I'm going to explain to you, and this is where we get a little technical. This will be the most technical that I ever get in this entire class. And it won't last long. I'll make it short and painless. No, it'll be painful, but it'll be short. So why the difference? Why is it that when we go to Psalm 95, we're seeing place names, but when we flip back to Hebrews chapter 3, we don't see place names, but we see other descriptions that seem like maybe they apply to more than one place. So I need to kind of walk you down a little bit of a road. So at the time of Jesus, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, okay? But at the time of Jesus, there was a Greek version of the Hebrew Old Testament being used. I'm not going to say exclusively, but by the masses, it was. It was the accepted version, especially in the Greek Hellenistic world, Greek-speaking world. So starting about 300 years before Jesus came, and it was a long process, this Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, okay, originally based on the 70 people that started the translation process, Septuagint. It was being used. It was so popular, in fact, that when the New Testament authors go to write their Gospels and their letters in the Greek language for the New Testament, they don't grab a Hebrew text because they quote Old Testament a lot in the New Testament. they're not grabbing a Hebrew text and translating the Hebrew into Greek themselves. You might have thought that was the case. What did they end up doing? Well, they ended up grabbing a Septuagint, a Greek translation, and they copied the Greek translation into when they wanted to quote Old Testament. This makes sense just from a practical standpoint. If everybody's out there reading a Greek translation and you're wanting to quote something out of the Old Testament, why go back and try and retranslate it into something that they're not going to recognize? Let's just take what everybody knows and place it here and build our argument around that. It's really a great argument in favor of the ability of man to translate the Word of God into other languages and still keep a meaning that is trustworthy. So we got the Septuagint. And when it comes to translations, there's kind of two ways that you can get meaning from one language into another, from Hebrew into Greek in the Septuagint. Sometimes you're translating. I'll start with this one because this is the easy one. Everybody kind of understands what translation is. Translation is, what do? We take a word in one language, we ask, what does that word mean? And then we go to another language and we find a word that means something similar in this language, a word or a phrase, right? And then we write down that meaning of the word in the new language. That's translation. You might feel insulted right now, but I'm going to a place that I might lose you. The other option, when translators have this process going on, the other option is sometimes they choose not to translate the meaning between languages, but to transliterate. What do I mean by that? Transliteration is the process of changing not the meaning, but the sounds of the letters from one language to similar sounds of different letters in a different language. Okay, I actually have a PowerPoint for this, so I'll bring it up in just a minute. What we see here, though, let me just point it out, and then hopefully you can see it. I'm in Psalm 95. I'm in our English translation. Our English translators go back to the Hebrew Masoretic text. Do not harden your hearts as at Meribah. Let me ask you this. Before you started reading the Bible, did you know the English word Meribah? No, because it wasn't one. The English word Meribah, the English word Massa didn't exist. How were they created then? Well, the translators went to the Hebrew Bible and they read the Hebrew word, and guess what that Hebrew word, when it's read, guess what it sounds like? Meribah. It actually goes backwards because of Hebrew. Meribah. And so what they decided to do sometimes with proper nouns, names, we see this in the New Testament a lot. Cephas, who is called Peter, right? Okay, that's a translation, transliterations in and through there all the time. So when they got to Meribah, our English translators decided not to translate the meaning of the Hebrew word Meribah. They decided to transliterate it and just carry the sound of that word into English, and in so doing created a new word, right? Now the problem is this, that's the way we handle it with English translations with the Hebrew text in front of us, but the Septuagint translators had a different theory of how to do it, and oftentimes they would not transliterate, but they would translate the meaning of the word, and that's what happened here. They went to Meribah and they said, what does that Hebrew word mean? And then they said, let's find a Greek word and put it into our Septuagint, Greek translation of the Old Testament, as the meaning of that word, not the place name, in other words. Okay? With that explanation, let me try and point this out to you. So this is how we did it in the Old Testament from Hebrew into English, straight from Hebrew into English. We went to Psalm 95, we saw Meribah, okay? We knew that it meant place of strife, but we decided not to translate that we decided to transliterate it into, and we created a new English word, Meribah. Now, how do we handle that? Because people want to know what it means. There's usually a little one by that. And you'll go down to the cross-reference and it'll say meaning, place of strife. So we transliterate and then we footnote the meaning. Okay? The Septuagint, now we're in Septuagint. We're still at the Psalm 95 because that's what the Greek Jews, the Greek-speaking Jews had in their hand. They had Meribah. And what did they do? Well, when they created the Septuagint Psalm 95, they chose to find a word that closely means place of strife. They chose to choose rebellion or revolt, a Greek word that means that. They translated it. Do you see that? And so when that got read, because this is what our New Testament authors use to write the New Testament, and when the author of Hebrews grabbed his Septuagint and quoted Psalm 95, he didn't write Meribah, he wrote the same word, the same Greek word that meant rebellion. And then what happened when we get to the English translation that you have in the New Testament, the book of Hebrews? We went to the Greek translation, book of Hebrews, the original that not the original, but that we have, and we translated that into provoke. Do you see how it ended up provoke in our book of Hebrews, but it ended up Meribah in our Psalm 95? This is key because the rest of our argument that I'm going to try and lead you down through next week is based on this place, Meribah and Massah. It's based on what happens there, and I think that's what Psalm 95 says. I know that's what Psalm 95 says, and I'm convinced through extensive study in my doctoral program that even when a Greek-speaking New Testament Christian read the original manuscript and read rebellion and revolt, they understood it to mean something at that place, not a general reference for the whole 40 years in the wilderness. Okay? So the key is that we're going to find, the key is somewhere in that place, Meribah, the place given that name, where there was strife between man and God, there's something there that the author of Hebrews wants us to pay attention to and not mimic in an attempt to enter into the rest that's available to us. Because that strife that happened there at Meribah kept them out of their rest, the shadow of rest. And that's the argument that the author of Hebrews wants us to see.